Our second scripture lesson for today comes from the book of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 through 37. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an evil spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, Lord," she replied, "but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "For such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There were some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on the man. After he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, "Ephphatha," which means "be opened." At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. "He has done everything well," they said. "He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." Please pray with me. Dear God, may these words stir our hearts and bring our souls ever closer to you. Amen. Did you hear what I just heard in our scripture lesson today? Jesus just called that woman a dog. What the heck is going on here? Did we just really hear Jesus do that? Today's scripture lesson is a passage that commentators hate. Unlike our president, who unequivocally last month called Omarosa that dog for her tell-all book, commentators are quick to point out that Jesus actually uses the Greek word for doggies or puppies here. They try to soften or dismiss his remark as being sarcastic. They described it as being said by Jesus jokingly, with a twinkle in his eye. Many commentators are extremely uncomfortable with anything that hints that Jesus was not always perfectly approachable. They imagine and describe Jesus as perfectly affable, a perfect expression of love all the time. They believe that Jesus was this perfect human being without a whiff of sin of any kind. And because of this perfect vision of Jesus, this put down of this poor woman who's desperately begging at Jesus' feet for help seems to be completely out of character for the Son of God. The whole scene just makes these scholars doggone uncomfortable. And so, in order to explain it, I think that some scholars operate out of the context of their own theology in order to read sarcasm or humor into the text, something that is absolutely impossible for us here to prove today. Because without us being there, without us hearing the tone in Jesus' voice, without us experiencing the whole situation, we cannot know if Jesus was just teasing around with the spirit or not. We don't know for sure. And the scholars could be right. It could very well be that Jesus intended his comment to her in a funny but kind way. But what we do know is that this woman is not laughing. Her little daughter is in trouble, and she is in desperate need of Jesus' help. As any parent knows, when your child is in a terrible situation, your focus turns to one thing: getting your kid the help that they need. Parents from all over the world are alike in that they will often move mountains in order to give the kids the help that they lack. They do incredible things when their children are sick. Back in 2007, little Liam Witt was about 2.5 years old when his family received some devastating news. Their little son had stage 4 cancer called neuroblastoma. This is a rare form of children's cancer that attacks the nerve cells. When they went to the doctor to discuss treatment for little Liam, they were stunned and distraught to find out that 25% of the kids who are diagnosed with childhood cancers do not survive. Mostly because there are not enough cancer therapy treatments out there that are specially designed for kids. What is needed is a lot of funding in order to develop and test new cancer treatments that work for the little ones. The Witts were shocked to find out that only 4 cents out of every dollar raised for cancer research goes towards kids' cancers. Just crumbs of the financial cookie of the billions of dollars of cancer research. So right then and there, the Witt family pledged themselves to help develop new and better cancer treatments for kids by raising the funds to do so. At first, they didn't know what they were going to do. But then little Liam's mom, Gretchen, had a really crazy idea. She envisioned a larger-than-life bake sale with the goal of selling 96,000 cookies. That's 8,000 dozen. So she put the idea out there and she started asking everyone for help. The response back was huge. Soon she had 250 volunteers all baking and selling cookies. Within just 3 weeks, all 96,000 cookies were baked and sold, and over $400,000 was raised for kids' cancer research. But even after all those first batches of cookies were sold, orders for cookies kept coming in, and other people started creating their own cookies for kids' cancer events. And they continue to raise funds to support this cause for more research into childhood cancer treatments. And even though the Witts didn't intend to do it, a nonprofit organization, Cookies for Kids Cancer, was born. Soon the organization was featured in the national media, and they began to attract corporate sponsors. They have sponsors like Glad, King Arthur Flour, and the OXO brand of cooking tools. From the simple beginning of one mother desperately advocating for the life of her child, a movement was born, and it has continued to grow. Even though this organization was only founded in 2008, Cookies for Kids Cancer now has over 300,000 supporters in 6,000 cities and in 16 countries around the world. Every year they raise millions of dollars for kids' cancer research, and they have personally funded over 24 major research initiatives. Now this is kind of a similar thing to what's happening in our scripture today. One persistent woman with a huge commitment to the life of her child took a risk, sought out this foreigner, a man from Galilee, who it was said could help her. Once she found Jesus, she begged him for help, and despite his initial reaction, she prevailed. And a whole new aspect of Jesus' ministry began. From this point on, Jesus was not just ministering to the Hebrew people. From here on forward, Jesus was ministering to everyone, to the world. Jew and Greek, male and female, slave and free, everyone who had faith became part of Jesus' ministry. According to Mark, it is because of the faith of this woman that you and I, Gentiles of non-Jewish descent, are included defining characteristics of being human is that we're not born knowing everything that we need to know. As human beings, our brains are designed to always learn and grow and change. We're not just creatures that act on instinct. We are entities that look at the data, that change our minds, and we often try to do things in a new way or go in a new direction. This defining characteristic of humanity is why we teach our children, why we send them to school and Sunday school. And what we see in this passage in Mark is that Jesus' mind is changed. You could say that Jesus had a teachable moment in which it was evident that he was not only fully divine, but also fully human. Now, one of the early church controversies was this argument about Jesus being simultaneously fully human and fully divine, and how that practically worked itself out. The early church fought bitterly and split into different denominations over this question. They finally agreed on a statement on the nature of Christ at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The statement declared that Christ was one man, to be acknowledged in two natures, interconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. Christ was both fully human, fully divine, and as a human, growing and changing is part of being human. And here in this passage, I would argue that we see that fully human type learning occurring in Jesus himself. In the theology that Jesus would have been taught as a child, the Jews were God's chosen people, and they were to lead the rest of the world to acknowledge Yahweh God. What Jesus says to the Syrophoenician woman in this passage would have been a correct Jewish theological statement. Jesus viewed his mission to change the hearts and the minds of the Hebrew people first. Just like thinking that there is only a limited amount of money that can go toward childhood cancer therapy research, because statistically there are many more adults with cancer than kids. This was the prevailing point of view. But just like the Syrophoenician woman believed that even a crumb of faith would be enough, and just like Gretchen Witt believed that even something as simple as a bake sale could make a difference, a human mind can imagine that things can be different in the future. In the same way, in Jesus' own ministry, Jesus' thinking was opened up in a new way to the Gentiles, a whole people that had not been included before. So, you say, what does this mean to us sitting here today? As human beings, it is part of our very nature for us to grow, to change, to learn. The things that we knew for certain when we were kids are often challenged, and our perspective changes once we learn, and once we become an adult. This is part of what it means to be human. It changed the way that many people thought about the funding for childhood cancer therapies. It changed the way that the church thought and taught about the two natures of Jesus. And I would argue that being fully human even changed the way that Jesus thought and lived into his own ministry. In the same way, may we too embrace our own humanity, be willing to change our thinking, be willing to change our minds, even change our theology. May we be willing to change the way we think about other groups of people and be willing to minister to them in a whole new way. I hope and pray that we can all admit that we are all human and that we can all learn something, big or small, while opening our hearts into a new way of living and serving Jesus Christ. So be it. Amen.